Hello again. If you're just joining us, I am Tristan Tchaikovsky of TZLongsword, and I'm with Cory Winslow here visiting from MEMAG. We are talking about HEMA. So, Cory, KdF is dead, and we have killed it. What did we do? What happened here?
Well, I don't want to go so far as to say it's dead necessarily, because it certainly fulfills specific roles, as in recreating history. Mm-hmm. My opinion is that KdF, depending on the reasons for wanting to study historical sword sources, is not necessarily optimal. Mm-hmm. So my problem with specific parts of KdF began when I realized that KdF does not necessarily address some situations that arise in the fight, specifically with new people. Mm-hmm. You'll be fighting a newbie, and they will double hit you quite often. And unfortunately, we're simply not given the information of how to deal with this explicitly in KdF. So I started to look into exactly how to deal with this, and I found various writings from various masters, including George Silver, for one, stating how certain styles of fencing, in his case particularly Italian rapier, ended with both fencers being hit. Mm-hmm. And he says this occurs for various reasons, but one is simply that single-time actions performed in the wrong manner put both parties into danger. Mm-hmm. And I saw this throughout KdF.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was actually just going to ask you, what is it about the KdF system that makes it dangerous in this situation? And you hit the nail right on the head. And I've seen it so very often too. Let's talk about Zwerchau, for example. We were both talking earlier off camera about how the Zwerchau is dead, but I think to a large extent, any time, especially when you have, I would say even beyond noobs, when you have two people who are trying to out-trick one another, a lot of times it completely falls apart. And I don't necessarily know that that's the fault of the combatant. Certainly it can be. Certainly, lack of awareness of distance, time, situational awareness in general can lead to more, or I should say, less safe interactions. But if I had a nickel for every Zwerchau being performed against another Zwerchau and both people taking it across the arms or in the head, we wouldn't have to beg people for money for YouTube anymore. Like we'd be rich. So is this an inherent flaw, do you think, in the KdF system?
I cannot say for sure, but I do suspect that's the case. I think it really goes back to the fact that Master Johannes Liechtenauer's system seems to emphasize the single-time counters and de-emphasize parries, which, of course, parries, if done correctly, if you take this information from other systems, because, of course, Liechtenauer does not cover this, they create an opening in which you can safely attack or counterattack your opponent. But as we know, anyone who studies the Kunst des Fechtens, we're told never to parry. So this is a big divergence from common fencing that we see in other places.
And I think even in some cases that's mentioned specifically how doing a certain action. I'm thinking of Krumpau, for example, where the counter to the Krumpau, or I can't actually remember, but there's a situation in which case the operator throws a Krumpau and it's understood, it's actually mentioned specifically that in the process of doing that you're actually opening up an opportunity for the other person that you're then expected to shut down with a follow-up technique. But that's in a technique itself. It's saying, well, you are doing this thing almost specifically dangerously. It's perhaps offered as a provocation, but I'm not entirely sure that's how it's meant to be read. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can read. I mentioned Silver for one, mentioning that he says that the Italians, when they fight with their rapier system, I'm not sure he mentions a specific one, but in general, they have to wear coats of mail in order to not both be killed. And then we have a later master, I believe it's William Hope, but I'd have to be sure. He says that he's dealing with a small sword. He says that in the fencing hall, these single-time actions are beautiful to behold. They're extremely artful. But in actual combat, they oftentimes result in both combatants being stabbed. So again, we have to ask ourselves, are we practicing an art based solely on theory, or are we trying to make it actually applicable in the real world?
Yes, the quote, real.
Yes.
The perception of the medieval real world, outside of the fencing hall at least. Do you think the problem is that perhaps KdF, I hesitate to say that it's wrong or somehow bad, but is it too overly specialized?
Again, I cannot say for sure because I'm not even sure of our interpretation of KdF. But some people have been working on interpreting KdF and practicing it for so long, and no one has really gotten it to work the way it's described as, being able to work. So I would say, in my opinion at least, I'm leaning more towards the side that there is some kind of inherent, I wouldn't say flaw with KdF, but the way it's applied may be slightly different or completely different than how we want to apply it. It may have a very specific set of parameters in which to be applied that we don't even understand.
There are assumptions there that we just don't have the kind of cultural awareness of in its own kind of context. It's kind of interesting, actually, that you mentioned Silver and Hope, that in the vast flame war always that's been in existence, especially on the internet, between the German system and the Italian system, that now all of a sudden we're looking at English fencing masters now that might have some of these keys or some of these missing links, the fundamentals that we've been searching for so often.
Right, and they certainly, I don't believe, have a monopoly on it, because you can find, how to fence safely and well in other sources, but I'm not sure who exactly understood the philosophy behind how to fence well. It could have been that they simply had a collection of tricks that worked, and you can fence extremely well if you make it work for you. You don't even have to necessarily follow principles, but that takes a lot of skill. So it could be that some of these masters, what they wrote down in books, worked extremely well for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would work for a new practitioner.
Could it also have been a case of, my kung fu is better than your kung fu, where there are specific systems designed specifically against other specific systems?
Absolutely, and I mean, in the same vein, we know that lots of these systems were proprietary. So of course you want to, one up the other guy, at least in the eyes of your clients. So that's certainly could be the case.
And with that, one of the inherent problems there is that these individual systems might not, and probably in many cases will not work in the grand scheme of things unless you are focusing on someone who is trained in a very specific system, the system designed, or the system against which one system was designed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you are fighting someone conditioned to do a specific thing, then your system could be extremely effective against them or not extremely effective. So I think when we say, KdF is dead, that's certainly hyperbolic. But what we're getting at is that we are trying to go, we don't know the context of KdF exactly, and we're trying to look outside of the box, outside of a particular school, to figure out what works in a range of conditions rather than a specific condition in which KdF appears to work.
So let's talk about frog DNA again, because this is not the first time that you and I have had this debate. This is the first time we've had it in a kind of public forum, for sure. But I have always brought a certain external knowledge to how I understood the techniques, the system, the mode of teaching, and I say external specifically because this is beyond even the European part of HEMA. This is beyond the historical part of HEMA. I also study a very contemporary Japanese martial art, one that was founded in 1929 or 1931. I'm not entirely sure which, but this is an art that is very much very new, but also not unlike, I think, what a few of us in HEMA are trying to do, is pulling from historical sources, distilling that information, and rebuilding a system that works in a wide variety of situations, and not just in a very specific context. And I've gotten a bit of flack for that. I know Mike, over the years, has also gotten a lot of flack for the Japanification of HEMA, especially with the introduction of Tamashigiri. Although I think we finally moved past that, fortunately. Mostly. But there is something to be said for having the sort of data that a relatively modern or extremely modern sword art has. There is not a lot of guesswork about what a sword can do. I'm not going to get into the actual really grim history such that it is of the particular art that I study, but it is not just paying lip service to the sword. I'll put it diplomatically in that way. The swords were in fact used for very much their initial purpose, but just in a modern context. What can we do to HEMA or with HEMA in a similar vein? How can we shepherd HEMA, or KdF I should say, in a direction that will bring it a little bit more into a comprehensive system? I think that's probably our ultimate goal, is to relearn how swords work and how we ought to be using swords to make them work most optimally for a wide variety of situations. How do we do that without the far-reaching approaches, the frog DNA?
Well, I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, the original sources do not contain all of the information we need to reconstruct a viable fighting art. They just simply do not. So I think it's very important to study with someone who knows what they're doing to begin with, specifically some kind of living tradition. I think that will greatly help and guide how to bring back these dead martial arts and to make them live again. I think it's also very important to fight, to actually learn these things on your own, to develop your own skill. But I think it's also very important to ground yourself in the old traditions, to use them kind of as a litmus test to see, if your own research, as it is in sparring, actually pans out and fits with what they're saying.
Absolutely, and I think one of the ways that we have to go about it is research even outside of martial art.
Absolutely.
I know one of the things that I am fascinated by, although I'm not trained in, academically speaking, so I have to rely on other people's knowledge sets, is psychology for one, physics for another. I'm very fortunate actually to have a few students in my own fencing hall that are very well trained in physics. Both of them have PhDs in physics, so I can count on them to help explain the ins and outs and the just the hard science, the mathematics behind
That's helpful.
how swords work. Similarly, ideas behind psychology, why people react certain ways. Another thing is just human anatomy, the physiology, what happens when people are injured. The human body is injured or damaged.
That's extremely important.
One of the things that I'm constantly fascinated is the almost paradoxical idea that the human body is both really easy and also really difficult to damage significantly. I've looked into like medical reports about people getting stabbed through the heart and surviving. People getting stabbed in the brain through the skull, or shot in the head and surviving. And then we also have people getting just a nick to a vein or an artery and needing to be rushed to the ER because they're moments away from exsanguination. I mean, it's the human body is a fascinating and infuriating system that can be broken really easily, but is also super resilient. So all these debates that people love to have, especially like in the training halls, like, oh, this would have done X, Y, Z. This particular thing is like, I hit you right in the wrist and that would have killed you. We don't know. Like that's like the only way of knowing for sure is one of the jokes that we make all the time, especially here at Squinting Rabbit. We have a whole T-shirt dedicated to the joke of naked sharps. It's a hashtag. Hashtag naked sharps is literally the only way to definitively solve most of these debates.
Right.
But of course, that's going to land everyone in prison
Right.
or in the ground, or both.
As my wife Betsy likes to point out, one way you can get experience with actually damaging other living creatures in a legal way is hunting, because we know as medieval people did similarly, they used hunting to train for war and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Also quite gruesome, but yeah, I think that's probably the most legal and the most ethical way of doing kind of experimentation.
You get to eat the things you killed too.
Yes.
Unlike Hime.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And just a disclaimer here: if you're going to use a sword on a creature that you intend to eat, make sure that your sword is oiled with a non-toxic, a food-safe oil. For what it's worth.
Yes. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
That's important. Yeah.
So I think the most logical follow-up question is, where do we go from here? Even beyond KdF, but just in terms of learning the longsword. I've known you for at least a decade, I think, and I've also known you to be the sort of person that revamps your curriculum on a monthly basis. So this is almost a hard reset of our understanding and our approach to understanding and teaching longswords. So what does this mean for us as teachers?
I think the first question is, again, we have to ask ourselves what we want to get out of practicing with the longsword.
Okay, and just to clarify for our viewers too, at least as far as we're concerned, our context is, or I should say our motivation is being adept at this particular weapon, this particular tool, for the purposes of, in this order, self-preservation and killing other people, shall we say. That's the reason for the tool is unfortunately to do manslaughter in socially acceptable or unacceptable reasons, and also in a wide variety of situations, not just in judicial combat, not just in grand-scale warfare, but also perhaps for personal defense, civilian defense, policing your city, like every imaginable situation that you might be called upon to use the longsword for grave purpose, shall we say. So that is, I think, for both of us, what we're hoping to achieve, not just learning longsword as a sport of pursuit, but to learn it for its intended lethal use.
Right. And I think the way to do that is what Master Liechtenauer himself did, and what Toyama Ryu did, according to my understanding. And that's seek out people who know what they're doing and pick and choose, based on our own knowledge, exactly what teachings to incorporate into what we want to teach, what teachings, techniques, and then go from there and adjust accordingly as we move forward. So to use both historical sources based on our own knowledge, our own fallible knowledge, and then also guide that with living traditions that are actually in existence because, they've survived, because they work.
And I think another important point too, and this is something that we made in previous episodes, is it is a process. That is actually the goal, is to be on that path. There's no final destination. Even as a historical pursuit, and certainly in its own historical context, there's never the ultimate destination. There is a constant arms race in a literal sense, and also just in a learning sense of who has the means to study from more people, who has the economic means, for example, to get the best made swords, to dedicate more time to training. That is to say, time taken away from family lives, from work, for sure. All those things are relevant. Because the sword is the only thing that matters ultimately. But these are choices that people have to make now. These are choices that people had to make then.
Right.
So this is the process, shall we say? Not a process, but this is the process of martial arts, and certainly of KdF.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is the way forward. It's taking HEMA from these long lost dead martial arts and bringing them to the modern era where we're breathing life into them again. We're not just reenacting, but we're moving them forward as best we can in our own understanding.
And again, to make another reference to an earlier episode, talking about this frequens modus is very much the case with this process. It's constant motion, constant evolution, constant self-doubt or self-affirmation.
Mostly the doubt.
Yeah, mostly the doubt. That's honestly, that's hence, this is always an important component of any sort of understanding of anything, I think. To be fair, I think this is the way forward, is to just have a healthy honesty with yourself, and also I think the confidence enough to know when you're wrong and keep going. I think that's also, especially with this new understanding now, now that KdF is dead, it's just that almost Sisyphean process of just picking the stone up,
keep pushing
it forward, and that's the way it's got to be.
Yep, I agree.
So on a slightly more hopeful note, a little bit more optimistic, for people who have been training in a particular system, whether it's KdF or any other longsword system, but we're talking strictly KdF right now, and not only training, but have invested so much emotional energy, shall we say, the belief that this is a system that will work for me, because, looking at previous years, I think there was definitely that idea. You had it, I had it, Mike had it, that, this is it. This is not necessarily better than other systems, shall we say, at least I'll try to keep this diplomatic, but that this was a system that we could call our own. Now that we're saying that that's not necessarily the case, how does the student, shall we say, because ultimately we're all students, but how do our students pick up the pieces and move forward? What can they bring with them? That is to say, we don't have to completely throw out everything. What is the silver lining here? What can we bring with us as we move forward?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that everything they've learned is still applicable. It just becomes a question of how optimal everything they learned actually is. And I'm happy to say that most things that we've been teaching are still wonderful. Timing and distance, and even particular techniques, Sprechfenster, long points, or how things like that are still wonderful techniques. We're simply branching out and expanding upon them and looking deeper into the context behind them.
So things like the things that you didn't mention in KdF, for example, are Zwerhaus, our Krumphaus, our Schielhaus.
Right. We're looking proprietary techniques.
Yes,
right.
Proprietary techniques. Are we tossing them out, or are we keeping some of the lessons learned there? Are we just keeping them in our back pocket? Are we saying that these are really just specialized techniques for specialized contexts? Shelve them, let them get dusty. What are we doing with the rest of KdF?
I think that's definitely going to take more examination, but I'm going to say that's going to be up to the individual teacher. But I don't think it's a bad idea to familiarize yourself with techniques that even those you don't think are optimal, because people use them all the time. But I think it is important to experiment with them, to study them, to learn them, to understand if they work for you or if not, and why. So I don't think it's ever a bad thing to learn more. You just have to figure out exactly how you want to allocate your time.
One of the things I've always spoken of when referring to the process of learning KdF, not KdF itself, but the whole system to a student, is that what you're given is an embarrassment of riches, right? You have just this laundry list of techniques and all their inevitable follow-up, the what-ifs, basically, and there's a whole host of, I think you actually at one point had a number for how many techniques there were in a given manuscript. There are a lot.
There are a lot, over 100, yeah.
Yeah. So, again, given this embarrassment of riches, one thing that I've always talked to my students about this, how to deal with this, is that this is part of the learning process, right, where little by little you learn all these things, you add these techniques to your vocabulary, let's say, your technical lexicon, and then eventually you don't need to know all of them, you don't need to try all of them, you don't need to use all of them. Really what it boils down to is what works for you. It's the ownership of a very slim number of a few of these techniques, particularly ones that work for your attributes. And this is something that never comes up in KdF. The people who are taller, the people who have more wingspan, more natural reach, the people who are more massive, shall we say. I mean, it's harder to displace a sword of someone who is bigger because they have more structure, shall we say, behind the sword, as opposed to someone who is tiny and light, like ourselves.
Yes.
Things like speed, a natural, muscular speed, shall we say, or
Also,
natural processing speed. These are all attributes that are really never covered in KdF, but make all the difference when you're talking about martial arts.
Also psychology. I mean, that's a huge deal that aren't usually covered. Meyer talks about it a little bit, but earlier KdF sources do not.
Doesn't at all. This is, I think, at the end of the day, take what works for you.
Yes.
Throw out what doesn't, and I think that is an okay thing to do, to be proficient in KdF. Even post-mortem, you don't have to feel like you have to do all of the KdF techniques or even have them on call.
Right.
Even if it's just a few things, even if it's just the general idea behind KdF, I think that is still doing KdF.
I think so too. Yeah, I think it is important to be honest with yourself. You know, don't delude yourself into thinking you're doing something you're not. But I think that's a very viable approach.
So this is a big RIP to the KdF.
As we knew it.
As we knew it. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to both of us on our YouTube channels. And if you really like what you see, please feel free to join us on our Patreon accounts as well.